So Julia, as you might all know, is now a master's student at the MIT in urban planning with a focus on international development. She already has a master's from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and then after that did a variety of very different but interesting things relating to international finance, and then taught in Colombia, I believe, and then wound up at the World Bank, where she, as a junior professional, actually worked on issues relating to access to water in Sao Paulo, and specifically on a project relating to a reservoir that she's going to be talking about in her presentation. And I had invited Julia to come and speak because in a John Briscoe's class last year, she had written about this topic, and I, as somebody who was interested in understanding different mechanisms for improving access to water and sanitation, was very interested in Sao Paulo's experience, especially because the issue of how do you really improve access to water and sanitation in informal settlements is such a critical issue. And I invited her to come share the observations that she's learned both from her field research and from other work that she's done. So welcome, Julia.
Thank you. I would encourage everyone to take John Briscoe's class. It was super interesting. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Sao Paulo's progress towards making universal access to water and sanitation universal in their informal settlements, which you also might know as favelas. I'm going to switch between the two, but favelas become kind of a derogatory term in Brazil, and they use the term comunidades, which translates to communities, which I don't know how well that translates into English, so I'll just switch between them all. So these are some collected images from Brazil that you might be aware of, even if you haven't been there, that relate to water. Brazil's probably very well known for the Amazon, which holds most of Brazil's water. You've got the second largest dam in the world on the Brazil-Paraguay border, the Itaipu Dam, Iguazu on the tri-border. And then on the bottom, you've got the famous city of Rio de Janeiro with one of their informal settlements there. I chose Rio for the picture because it's a little more dramatic than Sao Paulo, which is kind of like a concrete jungle. And so I'm going to be focusing more on issues related to the bottom provision in informal settlements. So here's a map of Brazil, and you've got Sao Paulo down here in the south. It's the largest city in Brazil. The actual municipality, the city of Sao Paulo, is about 10 million people, and the metropolitan is over 20 million. And it's about an hour away from the ocean. So the bank likes to point to Sao Paulo as an example of good practice in terms of water management. They see water as one of the ways that Brazil's been able to promote sustainable growth and equity and an inclusive society in terms of poverty reduction, economic development, and in terms of expanding water and sanitation services to many of its people. More than 80% of Brazil's electricity comes from hydropower sources. So that's another way that they've been fueling their economic growth now is through hydropower, but it is also controversial in terms of building dams in the Amazon. I'm not going to talk about that, but I would be happy to answer questions. I wrote a paper on that last semester, so I'm far from an expert, but I do know a bit about the Amazon debate. So these are some of the main water challenges that Brazil faces. Even though it does have one of the largest water sources in the world, many areas face water scarcity, especially in the northeast, right here, and in the south, in the metropolitan areas of Rio and Sao Paulo. These metropolitan areas also face issues dealing with water pollution, especially in urban areas. The building of the informal settlements without any kind of sanitation services led to a lot of pollution. You've got drought and flood events related to climate change, drought in the Northeast, and flooding, landslides. I don't know if you read about that. I think it was last year in Rio, significant landslides killing about 100 people. And then unequal access to water and sanitation services. So Brazil has about 15% of the world's freshwater resources, but in many ways the distribution of these resources reflects many of Brazil's inherent inequalities. The Amazon holds 12% of the population, but about 80% of the water. The Northeast, which is the poorest part of Brazil, has 35% of the population, only 4% of the water. And Sao Paulo has less than 2% of the water in the country, even though it's the largest city. So these are the statistics that I found according to the 2010 census of access to water and sanitation. 83% of the population in the entire country has in-house piped access to water, and 57% to the public sanitation system, and an additional 12% to a septic tank. I think it's very interesting to note the definitions that Brazil gives in terms of access, because it's not according to like the UN definition of improved access to water supply, improved access to sanitation. These are in-house connections, piped water, potable water. So if you looked at it in terms of UN definitions, these numbers would be much higher. But
yeah, I saw that. I checked it on Water Atlas and the other thing on sanitation. And Brazil as a whole is one of the best in the world. You know, it's like one level down from, say, the United States. Or
it's pretty much how you define access, and how I think that the UN would define access depending on different countries and different contexts. I know, I mean, in the US, if we had a standpipe and that's how we had to go and get water like 100 meters from our house, that wouldn't count as access, and that wouldn't count as access in Brazil. They, I mean, their way that they would think about access, it would be very similar to what we do in the United States.
And when you say public sanitation system, does that mean public toilets, or does that mean
No, it means
in-home
in-house.
access?
Yeah, no, there are not public toilets.
It means
would
toilets that
not
are
be
connected
me.
to a public sewage
Yes.
system.
Yes. But these statistics mask stark disparities between urban and rural areas. As you guys can see, the green on the bottom is the rural access, and it's significantly lower, and it's been making some progress, but could be doing more. It is so important to note that 85% or more of Brazil's population is urban. It's a very, very urbanized country. It's one of the most urbanized countries in the world. So these disparities are very stark, but it doesn't necessarily signify that there's huge populations in the rural areas, because most people do live in cities now. So even though the rural areas are in some ways much worse off, I'm actually going to be focused on the urban areas, partly because that's where I worked, but also because it does concentrate the biggest numbers of people without access. About 13 million people in Brazil cities don't have in-house access to water, and about 80 million people aren't connected to the wastewater system in all of Brazil's cities. And these are photos that I took this summer. Actually, this one on the left, I have to lie, is actually Rio. But that one on the right is Sao Paulo, so it gives you kind of the worst case that you'd find in some of the slums, but still a lot to be done. So there's many challenges to serving the informal settlements. The World Bank describes it as a water engineer's nightmare. It's crowded, it's chaotic, they're often on steep hillsides or in floodplains. Some of these places, especially the newer ones, don't have strong local organizations, and they're dominated by drug traffickers and violence. That's actually the focus of my research now. I was in Sao Paulo this summer researching the main drug trafficking organization there. Is called the PCC, and they essentially control almost every slum in Sao Paulo. So often these drug gangs can control access to water, and they will use it to finance themselves. So people have to pay much higher prices for water, and then there's the water company is reluctant to go in and service these areas because they have to kind of negotiate with the drug traffickers. When I worked at the bank, we were only permitted to visit some of the communities at certain times of day, usually in the morning. And our counterparts in the government of Sao Paulo would negotiate with like community leaders, who then would essentially negotiate with the traffickers there, just to make sure everybody's on the same page.
And when you said that they control access, do they actually have any control in terms of raising prices of water and sanitation, or no, because that's all in-house?
No, it's all in-house. It's just if like a house doesn't have in-house access and they have to buy their own water, then the traffickers would charge for that. But many people have quote-unquote illegal hookups. I don't like to refer to them as illegal because if these people aren't being served, they're kind of serving themselves. So I think it's touchy to call that illegal because people do need water. So these are all pictures that I actually took in Rio and Sao Paulo this summer of some of the informal water hookups, and these are actually the police. They are not the drug traffickers.
So when you said 83%, and that would include in the informal settlements,
Just all of Brazil.
it's how much of that is based on sort of planned water piping expansion? How much of that is in
Good question. I'm not sure. Yes, Ben?
Who pays for the water? Do residents pay?
Yes. For the legal hookups, yes, that they are charged a bill. There's like a social tariff. I'll show you what those numbers are. I have a slide on that at the end. There's a social tariff, there's a favela tariff, and then there's like the normal person tariff, and then there's like commercial tariffs and industrial tariffs. Like these hookups, no, nobody pays.
But even if they don't have tenure, they still would pay for the service?
Yes, and that's something I'm going to get into. That's kind of an innovation there.
About what percent of people in the informal settlement have household connections?
It depends where. In Sao Paulo, almost 100% now have formal water connections. It's kind of like the ones who don't are the newer ones, and that's what they're building. In Rio, I would say much less, and that's why I'm focusing on Sao Paulo, because it's a little bit better story. And then in the Northeast, much less, but I don't have those numbers, and the census doesn't break it down by like favelas, so the census kind of breaks it down by municipalities, so you can't really get that. Or you'd have to go out and get it yourself.
So as far as the water that isn't, or is that metered at all?
Yes.
It is metered?
For the formal connections, it is metered. This isn't, because these are like an illegal hookup, but yes. Sept does, the Sao Paulo Water Company does meter the formal.
So there might be a way of knowing how much volume is not covered by or doesn't provide revenue.
Yep. So I think Sept is something like, what it might be, it's like 20-something% non-revenue water. And when I was down there, they actually said most of that is from like maintenance problems, much less than like illegal hookups.
So two things. One is Sept is the Sao Paulo Water Municipal Agency, and then that term non-revenue water is kind of a term of art that water utility managers will use to that can include both water that is not metered or is lost for revenue purposes or lost for physical losses.
So these are the numbers that I have found for Sao Paulo. They're based on the Sao Paulo State Water Company called Sept. They're based, the 2010 numbers are based on their numbers. The previous ones I got from the reading. So, as you guys can see, there's been a pretty dramatic increase in terms of access, especially in the 1970s and the 1980s, and that's the story that I wanted to tell today.
Sorry, I'm sure this is hard to data too, but when you say access to the services, do you mean like the whole chain, so the disposal, the supply, the distribution? Or are you mostly looking at the actual, like, what they get in their household? So not like, for example, for sanitation, not sewage collection wouldn't be in that number?
No, sewage, sorry, could you like?
So like what percentage of the entire sewage is actually collected? Right, not just how many people have a toilet, but...
No, this would be collection. This would be,
Okay.
the sanitation is collection, and then of the 75% for treatment, 75% of all the sewage that collected is treated.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So, the informal settlements of Sao Paulo are interesting because a lot of them are located on the periphery of the city. In this map, the orange are the informal settlements. So a lot of them are located, some are located in the center, but it's very different from Rio in that sense. A lot of people have been pushed out to the periphery and close to the water bodies. Brazil made a law making it illegal, I think, to live within 50 meters of a water body, and so prices dropped. So that's where the urban poor moved, and there was no enforcement. So this is one of the informal settlements on the Guarapiranga Reservoir. And this is another one. This is where I was briefly this summer, and you can see some of the public housing mixed in with favela housing, and this is a community, again, completely under the control of the PCC, drug trafficking.
So that's interesting. So they created a law with the goal of environmental preservation, but there was no enforcement of that.
Yeah. So the main barriers in Sao Paulo to serving the informal settlements, and I don't know if you guys have worked anywhere else, you can think about whether these relate to the cities you know, are political, institutional, legal, and technical. So
You know, we've been talking about similar issues in the Middle East and Israel.
Okay.
The same issues.
So from Brazil, Brazil was under a dictatorship from 1964 to 85. So the dictatorship's policy towards Islam was bulldoze and eradicate and move people out to the periphery. Institutional difficulties. The water company wasn't really trained to work with the urban poor, and they had really no incentive to work with the poor. In terms of the legal considerations, they were reluctant to serve those who didn't have title to their land, and there's also a lot of technical difficulties of serving some of these communities. If anyone has been to one of the favelas, or maybe it's like that in other parts of the world, I mean, it's not easy in terms of engineering. So, the political context, again, Brazil was governed by a dictatorship up until 1985. During this period, there was extensive industrialization and urbanization. Brazil is one of the most urban countries in the world. And in terms of the urban poor, many of them had to build their own communities and build their own homes outside of the city. I was living for a couple weeks this summer in Sao Paulo with a family. They built their own house. They had to demand from the government to get their own electricity, to get their water. It's completely self-constructed. But during this political transition towards the end of the 70s and the early 80s, the government policy went from eradicating the slums to urbanizing the slums. And a lot of this was negotiation among government actors, and also significant pressure from the labor movement. Former President Lula was very active in the labor movement, and that drew a lot of force in Sao Paulo. So according to the reading, if anybody did it, you don't need to because I'm telling the story now, but Gabrielle Watson, who wrote her thesis on this topic, really saw the political context as being very important, the opening from above and participation from below, really forcing the water company to make a change in terms of serving the urban poor. So I think that's a dynamic that we need to keep in mind, like kind of the political context that pushed the water company into taking action. So the water company back then and today is still Sebespi. It was created in 1973, and it's the largest water company in Latin America and one of the largest in the world. Not back in the day, in the 70s and 80s, but just so you know, now it is, it's state-owned, but it's a mixed capital company, and almost half of its shares are traded on the New York Stock Exchange and the Bovespa, which I think provides an interesting context in terms of the public-private debate. Like Sebespi is a public company, but it's very governed by the private markets, and it's made very clear that its goal is the universalization of services in its concession areas, but it's going to do that according to like financial profitability standards and transparency. So it kind of creates a blurred line between public and private, which in some ways I think is helpful since the debate is often so like stark on either side. So some of the institutional constraints that Sebespi was facing back in the late 70s and early 80s when it was going to make the transition had very, very high service standards, and these didn't always match with some of the unplanned realities of the informal settlements. One of the reasons it had all these high quality standards was to reduce the need for maintenance in the communities, but again, because of the reality of the informal settlements, it made it very difficult to implement this equipment, to implement these quality standards. I mean, many of these communities don't have paved roads, and so how do you put in pipes, and then with all the pressure on the roads and the narrowness of the streets, so all of these issues. Also, Sebespi didn't have anyone internally who was trained to work and negotiate with informal settlements. That you needed a lot of negotiation to implement a lot of this infrastructure, and they were engineers, and that's how they thought, and I don't know if you can necessarily blame them for that. They weren't meant to work with the community.
And one thing that I thought was interesting, Julia, is in Gabrielle Watson's thesis, she talks about the fact that from an engineering standpoint, it's much easier to build put in high quality piping, because then you put it in the ground once, it's buried, you don't think about it, and that from a resource standpoint, it's easier from a planning standpoint to put your resources there than to hire a ton of people to go out and try and actually build and adapt to your engineering standards.
Mm-hmm. And they really wanted to keep their standards high, and that was one of the biggest points of resistance. They felt that they were going to have to lower their standards to go into the informal settlements. So some of the technical constraints I've gone over, sometimes steep inclines, which, could block sewers, and you need extensive pumping stations. The narrow winding streets made it difficult for trucks to enter, and so maintenance was very difficult. You needed a lot of negotiation between neighbors if you had to lay pipes across somebody else's land. As I said before, many of the communities were in environmentally sensitive areas, flooding, landslides, which made it difficult to put in infrastructure, and not very adequate solid waste disposal, so residents would often just dispose of their trash in the sanitation infrastructure, and then this made maintenance even more difficult.
I know that Sao Paulo, you mentioned, doesn't actually have the condominial sewage system, but could you just say a word about that? Because I feel like Brazil is known for that type of innovation in sanitation.
So condominial sewer is a type of sewer system that was started in the Brazilian northeastern city of Natal, and it's a low-cost way of providing sanitation. It essentially, instead of I don't really know the technical terminology, but it's kind of built like a condominium, in that you have one main trunk line, and then the houses have to technical term, the houses connect to that trunk line, but instead of having the main trunk line go to every house,
Laterals?
yeah, you just sort of build, and you can build like, in the back of the house, in the front of the house, but it's a much less expensive way of providing sanitation. Actually in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, it is the sanitation system for rich and for poor, but it's been used in like Salvador, Natal, and it's used in Pakistan apparently.
But why was it not used here? Was there no need for it, or?
You know what, I'm not really sure, but a part of me would wonder if Sebespi is kind of like, this is how we do it, and we're the best in Brazil, and we're gonna keep doing it our own way. Condominial is still kind of controversial because it does involve a lot of like community negotiation, and the community has to work together, which is sometimes complex in like urban environments, I think. So the legal constraints, Sebespi, its concession from the state government was that it was supposed to serve streets that conform to the city's design criteria, and the informal settlements clearly didn't meet these requirements. Many of them lived on public or private land where they didn't have title. They also were in environmentally protected areas, so essentially serving these communities with water and sanitation would be a way of legitimizing them, because why is the government going to hook them up to water and sanitation and then bulldoze them? And Sebespi didn't really want to, put its hand in the fire because they're a water company. They're not going to rethink the government's land titling policy. So, in many ways, I can understand why they want to get themselves involved in a legal mess. And that's, I guess, something that I would be interested in discussing later is if you also, what do you think about extending public services? And is that really a means of legitimizing urban land occupation? Because in Brazil it came to be seen as one. Many of these people don't have legal title, but in Brazil the focus isn't as much on title anymore because the threat of slum eradication is essentially passed. There's a democratic government, which is very important, but by hooking up people to these services, by paving the roads, by bringing in electricity, by bringing schools and public health centers, people don't feel as threatened that they're going to be kicked off their land, even though they don't really have an official piece of paper saying that.
Yeah, that's a question I think at the end we should definitely come back and visit, because I think it's a really interesting question from a human rights perspective as well, which is that if governments have some kind of obligation, whether it's moral or legally binding, and I think it would be a great conversation to have, because this is an issue that so many parts of the world face.
So I'll first talk about I'm going to talk about now about how Sao Paulo overcame some of these technical, legal, political, institutional constraints, starting with the pressures from below, though I admit I'm going to be focusing mostly on the pressures within Sebespi and from above. But a lot of it started with community mobilization. Again, Sao Paulo was very active in Brazil's democratization movement because of the strong labor movement there. So just an anecdotal quote from Gabrielle Watson that community members arrived at Sebespi's doorsteps, banging their buckets, bringing samples of contaminated water, pretty much demanding that Sebespi serve them. So in some of the more consolidated communities, you had neighborhood associations leading these protests, busing in people, trying to organize, just like constant pressure. They would offer to mediate between the water company and the residents by negotiating access rights. They would monitor construction. They wouldn't actually participate in construction, but they would monitor what was going on. And this essentially led to more increased engagement with the government. Yes?
What does it mean to monitor the construction process?
To make sure that, let's say, that they're supposed to build with a certain kind of material, that they don't build with like a less quality material so that it would break down. They say they're gonna do X number of connections by X date, that they actually do it, just to make sure they follow through their contractual obligations.
So what's the system?
They-
Do they set up meetings every week, every month?
I don't know the extent of that detail, but apparently the community, the more active communities, and this is not all of them, not everyone has like a neighborhood association where it's active, but the leaders would, they knew what the agreement was between Sept and the community, and if it wasn't being followed, then they'd go back to Sept and be like, here.
Did they use any formal documents?
I don't know. I have to admit, this is the part I know least about. It's probably very interesting, but I was more focused on what actually went on inside Sept.
It's interesting, the document you provided, though, they did seem very technical. They were saying, like, they had a problem with leakage, and rather than just saying fix the leak, they had people who researched why the leak was happening, and they were able to present a technical argument to Sept. So, you know, it's a whole different viewpoint of, you know, someone just saying it's not working, fix it, or actually digging in. So I'm sure seemed to lead that some of the monitoring stuff was also fairly technical. Who they had, I was impressed.
So some of the pressures from above came with the democratization process. When they started having democratic elections for governor in Sao Paulo in the early 80s, the governor essentially started pushing Sept to start serving the urban poor because it was good for votes. There was also like institutional competition. Sept is a state company, and there were like municipal companies that were more involved in like urban upgrading housing issues. And so there was just, the government would kind of, these two levels of government would kind of compete in some ways, which I don't know how particular that is to Brazil, but it's something I still can't understand as long as I work there, like the state versus the municipality versus the federal government, and all kind of working against each other sometimes.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not a dynamic it's a dynamic that happens in the US too. I mean, it's more complicated in a federal country where you have federal, state, but in almost most parts of the world, you have this state or federal level with the municipal level, and oftentimes, it's interesting here because in many situations, there's a decentralization of management, but without necessarily a corresponding decentralization of the budget. And so that can also lead to other dynamics, but.
In Brazil, on the one hand, it's very decentralized, but on the other hand, it's still very centralized, so it's.
Is Sept just in Sao Paulo, or are they in other cities?
They're in the entire state of Sao Paulo.
Okay.
But within the city of Sao Paulo, they serve the entire city of Sao Paulo, not the whole metropolitan area, but the whole municipality of Sao Paulo, the big 10 million person city that they do serve. So this is actually what I'm going to focus most on, are the pressures within Sept, the technical, institutional, legal innovations that push Sept from kind of reluctance, like a hands-off position, to becoming a company that is really devoted itself to achieving universal access. So first of all, the institutional changes. Again, the first democratically elected governor of Brazil pushed Sept to create a team to work inside the informal settlements and to start serving them, addressing their demands. And the coordination of this team was given to this guy named Ricardo Araujo. And this is him right here, and he still works for Sept, which was really interesting for me because I worked with him at the World Bank when we were down there for a project, and I'm reading this thesis like a year ago, and I'm like, wait, I know that guy, and I had no idea. that he was the first person to lead Sebespi into the informal settlements, and he's still there, and that's what he's still doing. So that was kind of interesting. So his first task was mostly just listening to the community. There was a lot of ambivalence according to many communities. You know, they'd been essentially neglected by the state government for so long. There was sort of like a honeymoon period because of the democratic elections. You know, people were willing to maybe listen to what Sebespi was going to say, but his first job was essentially just listening to what they needed. So once he heard, he pushed Sebespi to make a lot of changes to it. Some of its, sorry, my sister-in-law, to make some changes to its its technical requirements, its very high technical requirements. Araujo essentially pushed them to change, and he was able to do this because his team was given a lot of autonomy within Sebespi to make these changes, but in many ways they were kind of like informal. He decided to reduce the street width requirements from 4 meters to 3 meters. It was sort of an informal thing. He went around and told the Sebespi district team that was responsible for a district with a favela, you can go in if it's 3 meters. And so that's what they were able to do, and it increased the number of streets that they were able to serve from 3,000 to 27,000 just by making that one change. And later on, they figured out how to serve homes on an even narrower width. He also introduced this new kind of material for water lines. It was more flexible and less expensive. It wasn't able to be used in kind of the more formal areas because given the weight, you know, of if you're going to have trucks driving over the street and everything, you needed to have like a very specific kind of material. You're an engineer, I don't know anything about that. But
we're actually using this in like southwest Boston, as opposed to New York City. It's like this kind of flexible material for their water line.
So these are two of the technical changes he was able to implement, and that's a photo I took of Sebespi doing ongoing work even up to the past couple of years.
You might have mentioned this, but how did he get into the company in the first place?
So he wasn't an engineer. He was appointed by the governor to make Sebespi.
So they had to take him basically. It wasn't like he applied for a job.
No.
Okay.
But because of, I think, the dramatic political changes that Brazil was going through, this was still pre-1985. This was like 1982, 83. So Brazil its democratization was negotiated democratization, and so the first democratically elected governor of Sao Paulo came in before they actually had presidential elections in 85. So this is very much like a push from the state governor. He won the election based on his saying he was going to serve the poor. And so he had to go and win votes. And so he was pushing Sebespi to do that. Yes, Ken?
I'm just thinking, because I've seen similar kinds of bureaucrats in other countries, and they come in to change everything around, or they're given that mandate. But this guy wasn't an engineer, so how does he learn that these are things that could make a big impact? Is it his own employees? Is it outside consultations, like I think maybe with the community, maybe someone else, that leads him to think that these are the technical decisions that could have a big social impact?
So I think, from what I know, it was kind of like an experiment. He thought that they could serve communities with serve streets of like less than 2 meters. But so that's why he first said, well, let's serve 3 meters. Let's see if we can do this. And then we're going to, kind of take like a little step, experiment, see how that goes. Even though he thinks they can go all the way down to 2 meters, that he takes one little step.
Couldn't they just change the size of the trucks?
What's interesting in Rio, what they're doing now, not for water but for trash collection, they've made this new, the trash collection company in Rio has made like a motorcycle with a kind of thingy on the back, and that's how they're going to do trash collection in the slums in Rio now. So they are, that like another public service company has come up with that idea.
Part of it also seems to me just the importance of political will from the top. So maybe he had a way of it'd be interesting at some point to maybe go back and interview him and try to understand exactly what his style is and whether, but it seems like this was definitely a shakeup of the status quo. It probably was expensive, at least initially, to be changing things, but he had the political will to do it, then that, I think, potentially went a long way.
And kind of piggybacking on Ben's question, so I can see how the constraints are pretty obvious, like which ones they should focus on multi-standards, like the width of the streets and the material of the piping. But then, do you have any idea how he went about finding the kind of material? Like whether that was consultation within the government or with the engineering office in Sao Paulo? Because I think that was a little bit your question, right?
Yeah, I'm also wondering, like, you're saying he didn't even have much experience in informal settlements, so how can you even begin to think about these issues? Is it someone at Sept that's saying, you know, this is the constraint that's holding us back the most? Is it community members who are saying, we want Sept to come in, but they keep on saying that the streets are too narrow for us to come in?
So Sept had served, I mean, in some ways, it's not like Sept hadn't served like any of the informal settlements, but they were able to serve kind of like the outsides of the settlements. It's kind of like getting into the interior. I'm not like it's really hard for me to say because I haven't interviewed him for this, but
has anybody in other parts of the world worked or had this type of experience? And I'm wondering if you've seen or read about failures or other situations where you haven't been able to have this kind of change.
I mean, the one that I'm thinking of is the Orangi pilot project in Karachi, where they drastically reduced the standards. They changed the whole MO of how the municipal government is interacting with the communities in terms of even the technical relationships, where the municipality is installing the bulk infrastructure and then the communities are installing the connections by lane. But in each case, I think it's curious how do you figure out what are the technical innovations as well as kind of the broader institutional innovations that allow you to reach that scale. That 3,000 to 27,000 is big.
Yeah, I think that these are really important questions to raise. I mean, and part of why we like to have these as discussion groups is to try to identify, these are important questions to be asking. And I think one part is the institutional issue where you compare the Orangi pilot project, which is in Pakistan, that it was a very different model because there's much more, half of it was community owned. And here what really interests me is that they really weren't, it seemed like, relying a lot on the community to be digging the trenches and forming community water boards and a lot of things that a lot of development projects, especially sort of demand-driven, demand responsiveness types of projects require. This was very much, so they weren't using rights language, but a mandate to provide universal access to me is.
These are the 5 that the UN lists. Non-discrimination, so how I interpreted that, Sebesti's working to undo long-standing discrimination against serving the informal settlements. Participation, even though in many ways, it is implemented by Sebesti. Resident demands were very important in getting them to change their policy. Accountability. Sebesti is accountable to the state because it is a state-owned company, but it's also accountable to its private shareholders. And I think needing to balance that is something that Sebesti still has to it still works on, but it does make it very clear in its documents that, they're in English on the New York Stock Exchange. Their official objective is to universalize water and sanitation services, and they're very proud of their numbers, and they want to universalize sanitation, I think, by like 2020, but not gonna happen.
Do you know, have there been any ongoing demands by communities that are still not yet served, pointing to the, the fact that there is official statements?
Not that not that I know of, but I know that the work is ongoing. So it's mostly the poverty in Sao Paulo is becoming very peripheral now. So it's kind of like Sept is like kind of catching up with. Sao Paulo isn't growing as a city anymore, but the slums are. So in many ways, it's having to connect the newer and the relatively unconsolidated slums, which then have in many ways less kind of internal cohesiveness to like lead these kinds of protests, than like just locationally. I mean, it's working in Sao Paulo is like a nightmare. I mean, I was literally on the bus for like 2 hours trying to. You go to the end of the subway line and then take a bus for 2 hours, and it's still Sao Paulo. So impact. I think that in many ways the statistics speak for themselves in terms of improving access. Though without denying, I mean, you can go into some of these communities and you will see the poorest of the poor. I mean, people without water, without sanitation. But I think in some ways, the fact that it impacts me so much to still see that is a sign as well, because more or less in all the times that I worked in the slums, I remember just the first time I went being like surprised at how I didn't even feel like many of them were slums in a way. It kind of shows my naivete. But so when you see some of the people without access to these services, it's still impactful, which I think in reverse ways, it's good that it's surprising because it means it's not as common. And in terms of sustainability, that's what Sept is working to by focusing on sanitation. So conclusion, the narrative of Sao Paulo is essentially working towards universalization. It's still not there, but that's what they've been working towards. Community participation and public accountability. And then I wanted to think about with you guys to what extent the experience of Sao Paulo can be considered unique, and to what extent you think that this reflects good practice in terms of human rights principles. They bring up in the UN special report using the term good practice as opposed to best practice, which is something that I really agree with, because I think that in different countries, in different contexts, what is considered best is very different. And so I think that Sao Paulo presents like a very interesting case. It doesn't mean it should be copied though necessarily. And so I would really be interested, since all of you have a lot of experiences as well, comparing and contrasting this to some of the cities where you've worked. That's it.
Thanks, Julia.
Last time we were listening to a person in Bolivia that was telling the story of how difficult it was for people to pay for the service, and also the reclaiming of the water company business as public service, but still the people are not served because they cannot, this state company cannot achieve even good practices. And I wonder, what is it, the history of maybe this, the management of the company and the investment, maybe even, I don't know, did the World Bank invest earlier to help that, whereas the World Bank was more involved with this privatizing in Bolivia?
So I think Sept is somewhat unique in the developing world. I mean, in the world in a way. it's one of the few water companies that is traded on the New York Stock Exchange. So, I mean, they've definitely reached like an institutional level. I think that sets them apart from a lot of companies. Sao Paulo, in and of itself, is very unique in Brazil. I mean, Sao Paulo is the most developed part of Brazil. It has the largest part of the economy. I mean, it's very difficult to like look at Sao Paulo compared to Bolivia because just you're walking down the streets of Sao Paulo, and I hate talking this, but you don't feel you're not in a developing country. I mean, you're essentially in New York City, and this is a water company that is that, and these are the type. This is who they're serving. So I think Sabesp has always prided itself. I mean, it was created to be the best in Brazil. There's tremendous talent within Sao Paulo that they've staffed the company with like, excellent engineers. So I think
They didn't get in a really debt-ridden situation.
well, it's interesting because in the night, that's part of the reason that they started selling. They started moving towards being like a mixed capital company because in the 90s, when Brazil was having still a lot of economic problems, like now we all see Brazil as kind of like the brick, the shining star. That's a recent phenomenon in Brazil. That part of the reason they started going in the direction of mixed capital and raising money on the private markets is that they were having debt problems. And this was part of their solution to raise more money, but also to bring in kind of some of the discipline of the private sector. And I think that's just something that fascinates me about Sabesp is how it balances the public and the private sectors. And looking at like privatization, I've also worked in Argentina with the World Bank, and things are definitely different there in terms of like water and privatization and the nightmare that left on Argentina and like what Argentina is. Sabesp, it's a little more blurred.
2 follow-up questions on that, because do you know, and you may not know the answers to this, but 2 things that strike me is, one is on the affordability question. There is a question about how that subsidization net for the social tariff and the favela tariff is happening, and the rates that you showed us from the original tariff seemed, I mean, they were higher, and I'm wondering if you know at all if it's the subsidization is happening just within domestic meaning household water use, whether it's also subsidization from, say, other sectors of water, whether or not there is subsidization from other parts of the budget, and even, for example, electricity is usually a huge cost for operating water treatment systems, water pumps, and whether or not the fact that Brazil has plentiful hydroelectric power has played a role. I mean, all of those factors are usually...
It's interesting because they're building more dams though because they don't have enough electricity. And Sao Paulo had a major blackout 2 years ago. The entire city lost power for about 4 hours, which is a really scary thing in a city of 20 million people. So yeah,
so that's
electricity is one of the constraints. Energy is a constraint now on Brazil's growth, and that's why the dams and the petroleum that they found off the coast of Rio are becoming really important, because for Brazil to continue on its growth path, it's going to need energy.
One thing I was wondering, we've heard a lot of the refrain on a lot of reasons why they're not bringing water and sanitation into these undeveloped illegal areas where they're around favelas, is that they don't want to legalize and legitimize them. And when you say 85% of Brazil is already in the urban areas, and the comments we hear are they don't want to give these services to the illegal areas to bring even more people from the outside into these cities. And since they're already there, I wonder if that played a huge role in Brazil and why that, or in Sao Paulo, and why that's different from other areas.
So I mean, Brazil went through that, but like 20 years ago, where, I mean, they did have, I don't know if any of you have seen like City of God, the movie, that is a slum that it was in the wealthy part of Rio, right in there, and it was torn down in the 60s and 70s and moved to a more peripheral area, and essentially became a new slum. I mean, that was Brazil's policy for a long time, that they didn't want to legitimize these areas, and that's why they weren't providing them with services. But it became it became non-viable after democratization, and that was when kind of Brazil had become so urbanized already. There's not a way to undo that process. I mean, you've got like 4 million people in Sao Paulo living in a slum, like 2 million people in Rio. It's not, in the eyes of the government, they're essentially there to say, now, are there people being removed on the edges? Yes, with the World Cup and the Olympics. There's now a lot of real estate speculation, and there's people being moved because they're living in risky areas with really nice views. But, so not denying that it's not a problem, but there's no way that Brazil is going back to like whole-scale resettlement. Like I know in some of the other countries that you guys work in, it's just not going to happen in Brazil. I think a lot of it has to do with the democratic government.
And also the argument that it's going to bring even more people in doesn't work because they're already there.
There's not that many, I mean, that's the thing, yes, but there's not that many more people to bring in, so.
Interesting.
Is there a distinction between the favelas? Are there some communities that have preferential treatment based on like ethnicity or religion, or are they kind of all in the same boat?
They're pretty much all in the same boat. I mean, maybe like preferential in terms of location. I think that the favelas closer to the center of the city get preferential treatment because they're more of the eyesore according to the middle class. So I mean, they're going to get the benefits because the state's going to want to upgrade those areas first more than the peripheral areas. But in terms of ethnicity, Brazil's way too complicated to differentiate people. Pretty much, it's much, you're discriminated against by living in a favela, and it's not so much religion or anything else.
And one more question. Is the approach of this company and the government to dealing with the water problems part of a larger plan of dealing with favelas, and what is that vision? Like, is it relocation or just establishing them where they are?
It's like integration with the rest of the city, so they're trying to upgrade them where they are. There is like some resettlement, but that's not like, people are living right on the edge of the reservoir, then they'll be resettled, or if they're living like in a place where they're gonna be susceptible to landslides, but it is like on-site upgrading. The term like integração, like integration with the rest of the city is what they want. Improving transport, upgrading homes, paving roads, bringing electricity services. That is how the government sees that they're going to integrate people, is by bringing public services. And then security, that was becoming like a big issue, because people are saying, okay, well, how are you going to integrate areas that are under the control of non-state armed actors? So that is a whole nother issue that Brazil is going to have to look at.
And I know you haven't necessarily worked in other parts of Brazil, but have other cities looked to Sept for guidance on how to do this?
Sept does technical assistance in other parts of Brazil and in other parts of Latin America. I worked on a project in Panama, where Sept is helping the state water company in Panama, which is like a huge disaster company. I have to say, I'm so like sheltered by working at Sept, because then I got to Panama to work with this guy, and I was just like blown away by how competent they were. And so they actually doing technical assistance in Brazil and in other parts of the world. So.
Well, we have any final questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing, I'm struck by the way you describe the participation element in this, because in the cases that I've worked in South Africa, which has a history of green fields, full top structure, low-income housing development. Now that they're beginning to move to an incremental in situ upgrading approach, there's a recognition, at least in the policy documents that are going to form the basis for this program, that in situ upgrading is a much more invasive process than just moving people out to peripheral housing development. And because it's more invasive, the company has to go into somebody's house or go into somebody's street, there's necessarily a greater degree of participation that's required. And, in South Africa, you have many cases where municipalities install toilets or try to install water, and they'll be vandalized and destroyed by the community, in part because they don't view the level of engagement as relevant to the way they want this development to happen. So I'm struck by, or I'm just wondering, how could Sebespe avoid a lot of that, given what you're describing as the way they went about this work?
So I know that they have, they've decentralized the company in many ways, that there's like district offices within a lot of these communities that are responsible for implementing a lot of the investments. I know that there are community in Rio, for example, which is not served by Sebespe. There's a lot of community meetings where the state government can get in, and they bring in like the equivalent of Sebespe, the electricity company, the housing ministry, everybody, and they have like a community meeting where the community makes their demands, and essentially what the community wants is a timeline. That's what they always want. So they know kind of what they want. They want the same services that they see at the bottom of the hill. They're just like, so when's it going to happen? I still think what's really complicated for Sebespe is it's not so much getting in to do the work, but community organization is becoming extremely difficult in the communities where the leadership is now are these drug trafficking gangs, and it's been very hard for the state to have kind of this open dialogue. There's definitely dialogue, whoever is in charge, but it's much more hidden when it's with drug traffickers, and they've only been able to kind of make it more transparent when they've been able to kick the drug traffickers out, which is what they're doing now in parts of Rio. They're not doing it in Sao Paulo, and what's really scary in Sao Paulo is that there's one big group that dominates Sao Paulo. In Rio, there's many factions. So I actually think that's a really interesting question to look at in Sao Paulo, is what the government's going to do about that, because the control that the PCC has over Sao Paulo, I mean, they shut down the city for like a week in 2006 when the government tried to move their leaders to different prisons within Brazil. They shut down the city. Like, people couldn't get to work, people couldn't get to school. They killed like several hundred police officers. So yeah, it's, you go downtown Sao Paulo and that's one story, and then you go out to the periphery and it is under like the state government still kind of enters when they get permission, but there's definitely a different power structure there, which I think makes participation very difficult, because who gets to participate and what they're allowed to say and how much they're allowed to be seen on the side of the state government is very tricky.
Just in the interest of time, please join me in thanking Julia for the